All right, today on Wishful Thinking, we are talking about George Saunders' brand new novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, and drinking whiskey. A little bit about George Saunders. He is one of my favorite writers. First encountered him maybe, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And he was at the time one of the just absolute darlings of the literary scene. And everybody I know who was a reader and a writer was just throwing books at me saying, "Oh man, you got to read this guy, George Saunders. He's brilliant. Oh, you'll love this, trust me." And I don't know, there's something about me that just makes me a little bit reluctant to latch on to, like, the next new thing, the big hype thing at the moment. And I was a little bit reluctant to read him for that reason. And I finally broke down and I read his short story collection, Civil War Land in Bad Decline. And it was very, very good. Up until this point, Saunders has been able to do something which is unheard of in the modern literary world, which is to become as close to a rock star as a quote-unquote literary writer can become without ever writing a novel. All he's written is short stories. So he's finally gotten around to writing a novel, and it's this one called Lincoln in the Bardo. And the hype machine on this thing started, way back last year. And when I first read about the conceit of this book, I thought, I don't know, that sounds like it might be kind of clever. Well, it turns out that it is pretty clever, but it is also one of the most profoundly moving and most just comprehensively human books that I've ever read, and it packs a pretty substantial emotional wallop on top of that. And for that reason, I decided to pair it with something pretty stiff, and that's why we're drinking whiskey tonight. All right, so a little bit about the book itself, and I'll try to do this without giving too many spoilers away. Lincoln in the Bardo is kind of what it sounds like. It follows Lincoln, in this case not Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, but rather his son Willie Lincoln, who died at 11 years old, just as the Civil War was starting to reach its meat grinder peak. He died of a fever. And it follows him in the Bardo, which is a concept that Saunders, who has recently become a practicing Buddhist apparently, has borrowed from Tibetan Buddhism. The word Bardo essentially means a transitional state, the place where we transition between, in the Buddhist tradition anyway, the place where we transition between this life, the earthly life, and whatever comes next. The Bardo in this novel isn't particularly Buddhist. Saunders is sort of borrowed from a lot of horror tropes and kind of ghost story tropes, and he's envisioned the Bardo as this place, a very physical place, in and around the cemetery where Willie Lincoln is interred, and there are other souls who have been buried there, their bodies have been buried there, other souls who sort of inhabit this place. And exist in this kind of limbo, this kind of purgatory existence between the living world and whatever comes next. So Willie Lincoln himself kind of awakens here in the Bardo, and the novel itself is told by this just cacophony of voices. I think there's 166 different narrators. Out of this just cacophony of voices, we have three which kind of arise as the narrative trinity that tells the story. We have Hans Vollmann, who is an old man who's been around in the Bardo for a while, many years. And since people in the Bardo manifest in ways which mirror the circumstances of their life, or the reason in which they're trapped, or the thing they can't get over, Volman manifests as this naked old man with a hugely, grotesquely swollen member. And I don't know, that just makes it seem so much nastier than just saying penis or dick or cock or whatever. But anyway, so he's walking around in the Bardo with this, grotesquely huge hard-on, which he has to kind of lug around because he was an older man, I think in his 50s, and he's married to a much, much younger woman, and it's not what you think. He's a very kind, very compassionate guy, and he doesn't want to thrust himself upon this young woman and really just freak her out, so he has this more or less celibate marriage, and they become really good friends. They become close. They're married for a couple of years, and finally one thing leads to another, and they are, to borrow a line from George Clinton and Funkadelic, they are standing on the verge of getting it on right when Volman dies, which is why he's manifested here in the Bardo in that way. You have him. You have Roger Bevans III, who's a younger man. Roger Bevans is a homosexual who has killed himself out of grief because his lover, or would-be lover, has spurned him in order to go and lead a proper life. And he's a sensualist. He's enamored with the sensual things of the world and all the beauty and whatnot. So he manifests in the Bardo with all these eyeballs and hands reaching out to touch everything. And then you have the Reverend Everly Thomas, who sticks around in the Bardo for a reason, a much different reason, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Without giving too much away here, there is a particularly undesirable fate which potentially awaits children in the Bardo, people who have died very young. And these three narrators, in an attempt to save Willie Lincoln from this fate, they kind of start this quest to convince him to leave the Bardo, to let go, and to move on into the next world before this horrible fate befalls it. Well, as you might imagine, this novel is a meditation in a lot of ways on grief and on loss, and it also is a meditation on impermanence, or how we can accept the impermanence of our lives, which is also kind of one of the central tenets of Buddhism. And one of the most moving passages in the book is a meditation on impermanence, and I want to read from it here. And this is let me do a little bit of setup here. This is actually Abraham Lincoln himself, who is very much a character in this novel. He comes into the Bardo, and the other characters are able to inhabit him, which means that they kind of move inside of him and occupy the same physical space, and that allows them to be privy to his thoughts and his feelings at the time. I was in error when I saw him as fixed and stable and thought I would have him forever. He was never fixed nor stable, but always just a passing temporary energy burst. I had reason to know this. Had he not looked this way at birth, and that way at 4, and another way at 7, been made entirely anew at 9? He had never stayed the same, even instant to instant. He came out of nothingness, took form, was loved, was always bound to return to nothingness. Only I did not think it would be so soon, or that he would precede us. Two passing temporarinesses developed feelings for one another. Two puffs of smoke became mutually fond. I mistook him for a solidity, and now must pay. I'm not ashamed to say that when I read that, I wept openly. I just couldn't. I was reading it. I was at night, and my own kid, my 4-year-old, was asleep in another room, and it was all I could do not to just go and just pick him up and take him in my arms like Lincoln had done his the body of his dead son here, and I just found that very moving. And sorry. Actually, no, fuck that. I'm not sorry. You shouldn't have to apologize for having emotions. So that is kind of what it is. All right, so if that was the only thing that this novel had to offer, which was that very profound and moving meditation on impermanence, then it would still be great. But there's a lot more going on here, and more than I can talk about here. But one of the things that I do want to talk about is the Reverend Everly Thomas, who, as I mentioned earlier, sticks around in the Bardo for a much different reason than most of the other characters. Most of the people that we encounter here in the Bardo, like Volman, Bevins, and pretty much every other character, stick around here because they're unwilling or they're unable to get over it. You know, they're unable to let go of who they were in the previous life, and the circumstances of their life have just sort of conspired to leave them with these things that are just kind of unresolved and they just can't quite get past. The Reverend, however, sticks around in the Bardo because he knows, or he thinks he knows, what's going to happen to him next. When he first gets to the Bardo, he encounters what is a very memorably written but ultimately pretty typical Christian judgment scene. And he finds out basically that he is condemned to hell when he leaves this place. And the Reverend has lived a very pious life. He's been very earnestly attached to his faith. I'm not sure that his denomination is ever revealed, but he's, some kind of American Protestant. And again, very devout in his adherence to his faith, but like any intelligent person, racked by periods, no matter how brief, of doubt. And he thinks that is why he's been condemned to hell. And there's a couple of different ways of reading this, and one is that, hey, that's what's going to happen to him when he dies, but I can't buy that. And I think that what Saunders intends here is for us to see this as a meditation on the way that religion, especially those religions which are driven by fear, the way that can just squelch our souls, which is ironic given that it's meant to save our souls, but the way that it just cramps us and squelches us in a way that's just sad. And it's the thing that he can't get over from his previous life is this fear. And I can kind of relate to that, and that's one of my favorite things about this novel for that reason. And I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and I remember being a little kid and listening to all this hellfire and brimstone bullshit, and just deciding at an early age just not to believe it, because, and I'm not trying to come across here like I'm enlightened or something, because I'm certainly not, but I do think that being able to move past that was a big step in my life, and for better or for worse, the Reverend hasn't been able to do that, and he ultimately becomes one of the most memorable characters in the novel for me because of that, probably just because of my attachment to it. So, well, in the end, I don't know what else to say about this book except that it's brilliant. It is, as I said at the beginning of this thing, it is one of the most profoundly moving, and not in some Hallmark movie kind of way, but in a very genuine way, and one of the most just comprehensively human books that I've ever read, and I can't say enough good things about it. So until next time, keep reading and keep drinking, because where would we be without wishful thinking? Oh, and this is just an aside. If there are any bourbon companies out there who would like to sponsor this YouTube series, I'll shill for your whiskey.